I wanted to discuss today on the video podcast the drafting of bond legislation in the state of California and what is contained in bond legislation. Basically, for bonds to enact one, those must go before the voters, before the California state treasurer can issue the bonds and go to the financial markets. And there's a common misconception that all bond measures are approved only by the legislature. However, a bill authorizing the sale of state GO bonds, general obligation bonds, to finance any specified projects or activities as a bond measure, subsequent to its enactment, a GO bond bill has to be approved by the voters. So what are some of the main provisions of a bond bill? First, in the bill's title, after the relating clause, there's going to be a phrase along the lines of, by providing the funds necessary therefore through an election for the issuance and sale of bonds of the state of California and for the handling and disposition of those funds. Thereafter, in the Legislative Council's digest, there's going to be a description of the bond, something along the lines of, this bill would enact the blank bond act of, say, 2022 to authorize the issuance of bonds in an amount not to exceed a specified amount, to provide funding for, and then describe the purpose. The bill would provide for the handling and disposition of the funds. And then there's also going to be a sentence at the very end of the Legislative Council's digest that'll specify the election date. So for example, this bill would provide for the submission of the Bond Act to the voters at the June 7th, 2022 statewide primary election. In terms of the council digest keys, the vote's going to be 2/3. It's not appropriating money, so that's a no. The fiscal committee key is a yes, and the local program mandate is a no. In the next part of the bill, the substantive text that adds or amends the statutory language, you're going to find information about a description of the state general obligation bond law. And then you're going to have the information bonds in the amount of the specified amount, not including the amount of any refunding bonds, may be issued and sold to provide a fund to be used for carrying out the purposes that have been expressed in the bill, and to reimburse the general obligation bond expense revolving fund pursuant to Government Code Section 16724.5. The bonds, when sold, issued, and delivered, shall be and constitute a valid and binding obligation of the state of California, and the full faith and credit of the state of California is hereby pledged for the punctual payment of both the principal and interest of the bonds as the principal and interest become due and payable. There's also language about the bonds being authorized by the particular article or prepared, executed, issued, sold, paid, and redeemed pursuant to the state general obligation bond law that's in the government code. There's also an appropriation from the general fund in the state treasury in an amount that'll equal the sum that's annually necessary to pay the principal of and the interest on the bonds that were issued and sold as that principal and interest become due and payable. There will also be language about the director of finance can authorize the withdrawal from the general fund of amounts not to exceed the amount of the unsold bonds that have been authorized to be sold to carry out the purposes of this particular article, and that money is deposited in the fund that's derived from premium and accrued interest on bonds is reserved in the fund and shall be available for transfer to the general fund as a credit to expenditures for bond interest payments made. There will also be language about all or a portion of the cost of the bond issuance is to be paid out of the bond proceeds. and that the costs are shared proportionally by each program that might be funded through the particular bond act. There will also be language requesting the pooled money investment board to make a loan from the pooled money investment account for purposes of carrying out this particular bond issuance. And that any bonds issued may be refunded in accordance with provisions of the government code, which is all in the state general obligation bond law. And that the treasurer, if the treasurer sells bonds that include a bond counsel opinion to the effect basically that the interest of the bonds are excluded from gross income for federal tax purposes, then the treasurer can maintain separate accounts for the investment of bond proceeds and the investment of the earnings on those proceeds. There will also be language that the legislature finds and declares that the proceeds from the sale of bonds authorized are not proceeds of taxes under Article 13B of the California Constitution, and therefore the disbursement of those proceeds are not subject to the GAN limit or the state appropriations limit. And also you're going to see a plus section or two of uncodified language, including that, for example, the main section of the bill will take effect upon the approval by the voters of the particular bond act as set forth in that section. And also that the bond measure will be submitted to the voters at the specified state primary election or general election in accordance with the appropriate provisions of the California Elections Code, as well as the California Government Code that deal with submitting statewide measures to the voters. Now, these provisions that we've briefly touched upon are certainly not exhaustive, but these are some of the major provisions that are contained in a bond bill that's considered and adopted by the California Legislature and then put before the voters on a statewide election.